7 months after the last guns had fallen silent on the Western Front, 52 ships of Germany's high seas fleet were sunk, but not by the British. They were scuttled by their own crews after 7 months of internment at Scapa Flow in the remote islands of Orkney, northeast of the Scottish mainland. These ships, never defeated in battle, and many of which proudly bore the names of Germany's kings and generals, now lay on the bottom under Scapa Flow's cold, dark waters. Already in 1917, there were ominous stirrings within the fleet. Social and political divisions between the officers and men of the German High Seas Fleet had deteriorated badly. That summer, dissent broke out into the open. Poor rations and working conditions had become intolerable. The unrest led to sailors in the North Sea port of Wilhelmshaven to defy their officers' orders and to walk off their ships in protest. As a result, 2 young sailors, Max Reichpeach and Albin Kurbis, were executed in a show of force by the Navy's High Command. But as the fleet rusted away in harbour, the war in the trenches continued. Germany now threw everything it had into an all-out offensive. Initial success quickly ground to a halt, and by late summer 1918, the front was starting to crumble. With defeat inevitable, the Navy's leaders, hoping to exonerate themselves, planned a last, almost symbolic attack on the British. The Navy would be shamed, they said, if defeat came while their ships still lay at anchor. Sailors who might have been willing to defend against a British attack on their homeland saw this venture not only as something bordering on suicide, but as an act that defied the new government's wishes for peace. It was the last straw, and mutiny broke out. Sailors refused to raise the ship's anchors, and in the boiler rooms, stokers extinguished the fires. On a number of ships, the officers were locked up. Franz Hipper, the fleet's commander-in-chief, decided to play it tough and called the sailors' bluff. He ordered torpedoes to be fired on one of the ships, the fully crewed battleship, the SMS Thuringen. The orders had already been given when the sailors backed down, and a bloodbath was only narrowly avoided. The sailors, now fired up by what had happened, left their ships and took to the streets. They demanded an end to the war, a release of their imprisoned comrades, and their own better treatment. Hipper now made a serious mistake. Hoping to isolate mutineers on some of the more badly affected ships, he sent an entire battleship squadron to another harbour, Kiel. In the weapons manufacturing and shipbuilding town, the ships were greeted by dock workers seasoned by years of industrial action. What had been a mutiny now became a revolution. Workers, sailors and soldiers came together to oppose the traditional state. The communist red flag flew on the mastheads over the fleet's ships. From Kiel and Wilhelmshaven, the revolution spread inland and then throughout the entire country. Just days later, on 9th of November, the German Republic was declared in Berlin. It was the end of the Royal House of Hohenzollern. As the ex-Kaiser William II rode into exile on one train, the armistice ending the war was being signed in another, in a railway carriage at Compiègne. At the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, the guns on the Western Front finally fell silent. After 4 years and the deaths of more than 20 million, the war was finally over. For the Allies, it was a moment of jubilation. For Germany, profound demoralization. But for all, it was relief. For Germany's navy, technically undefeated in battle and still a potent threat, the armistice was an inglorious defeat. Inside the armistice provisions was a clause calling for the internment of the High Seas Fleet in a neutral port. The idea was to guarantee Germany's integrity while the peace was being negotiated in Paris. Hipper sent a senior German admiral, Hugo von Meure, to negotiate the terms of the internment. He met with Admiral Sir David Beatty and his staff on the Grand Fleet's new flagship, HMS Queen Elizabeth, the night of 16th of November. The talks were anything but a discussion, as Meure had little to say in the matter. Back in Germany, disarmament of the ships was carried out at breakneck speed. While ammunition and technical equipment were being offloaded, limited supplies of coal, food and water were taken on for the period of internment, expected to last for only around 36 days. Nobody wanted to give the Allies any excuse to resume hostilities. Finally, the ships were ready. Late in the afternoon of the 17th of November, they set sail for England. Their first port of call, the Grand Fleet's new base in Rosyth. It would be the Imperial Navy's last journey. At Rosyth, the British prepared for the Germans' arrival. Sir David Beatty theatrically set the stage. He wanted the nation, as well as his American allies, to see the enemy's fleet's arrival as decisive as a defeat at sea. The British public's faith in the Royal Navy had been eroded. Jutland had not delivered the long-awaited Trafalgar-like victory for which it had fought, although the German fleet had largely remained bottled up for the remainder of the war. A massive Allied armada, more than 250 ships of war, went out to meet the German ships, to escort them into the Firth of Forth, all under the humiliating gaze of the world's press, for whom the day had been especially staged. No chances were taken. Even the smallest of incidents could be the spark to a disaster. As the German ships neared, the guns on each Allied ship were kept trained and ready to fire on their opposite number. The German Navy has never forgotten Beatty's order that the German flag be lowered at sunset and not raised again without permission. These were, after all, still unsurrendered ships. It was now that the rumour started to go around the ships. They were on their way to Scapa Flow. The huge natural harbour had been the home for the British Grand Fleet for the first 2 years of the war. Early on the morning of November 23rd, the first German ships arrived in their new home. German Admiral Friedrich Ruger, then a young lieutenant, remembered its beauty, but also how desolate the flow could feel. As each group of newcomers arrived, they were assigned anchorage positions at the northwest corner of the flow, to the south of what was the seaplane base at Houghton. British ships of all shapes and sizes, fishing boats, armed drifters and destroyers, kept a vigil, constantly looking for anything suspicious on the German ships. Life on the ships soon became intolerably dull, each day filled with the same repetitive routine. The German sailors did what they could to bring some colour to their everyday lives. Concerts would be organised on deck or music played in small groups. Amateur theatre always provided moments of light-hearted escape. The hulls of the smaller ships, the destroyers, would be tied together to a single buoy so that spectators could gather on one deck while the players would perform on another. It was inevitable that the life on the flow would soon become an endless routine. There was little else to be done but to occupy oneself fishing or sleeping or sitting around aimlessly watching the days go by. Gradually, the days became weeks and the weeks months, and with every passing day, the ships looked more and more bedraggled. Food came from Germany, but it was basic and usually of poor quality. Diets were supplemented by fishing, catching seagulls, and as time went by, the ever-increasing rat population. Pigs were even kept on board some ships. An egg was a luxury that few ever tasted. Only coal and water were provided by the British, and always at inflated prices. From time to time, news would come from family or sweethearts back home in Germany. A destroyer, or the light cruiser Regensburg, the ship that had earlier taken Moira to meet with Beatty, would bring the mail across. This simple service helped the men feel they hadn't been forgotten. Vitamin deficiency and the poor diet inevitably led to a significant decline in the men's health. There were even cases of scurvy, something unheard of in modern navies. Despite this, the British did not even provide a dentist. As fast as possible, the Interned Fleet's commander, von Reuter, sent crews back to Germany. More than 1,000 officers and men went back in the first week of December. It was a chance for Reuter to get rid of troublemakers. On the flagship, sailors roller skated constantly over the steel decks of the Big Fritz, right above his cabin. The revolutionary sailors made his life so difficult that he decided to make the light cruiser Emden his new flagship. Before each group left for Germany, however, they were subjected to a final humiliation, a baggage search, which was often nothing more than a chance for the British to steal what few memories and keepsakes these sailors had managed to keep to this point. As the peace talks progressed, it became clear that the Allies really wanted the surrender of the fleet to be formally carried out. The peace terms were onerous. Specifically, Germany had to admit culpability for the war and consequently pay the bill for Europe's recovery. That Germany would not be allowed to keep the current strength of its navy was clear. A limit on the new navy was set at 15,000 men, with old battleships, no submarines, and only 10 destroyers being proposed. The question remained, however, what do they do with the interned German fleet? Each Allied nation wanted something very different. The Americans, for example, wanted the ships taken to sea and sunk. The French wanted to be allowed to rebuild their navy. At a terrible price, it had poured its national resources into the land war and now wanted to be compensated. Initially, the British, not wanting to give anything to the French, also wanted the German ships sunk. They then decided that they should get the lion's share, since they had lost the most ships in the war. As the signing deadline in Paris approached, Reuter had to guess what his options were. He didn't think any German would sign and feared hostilities might be resumed. Whether von Reuter took the decision himself or was ordered to do so by his superior von Trotter is still unknown. He maintained that it was his decision and his decision alone. The only option he saw to prevent their seizure was to sink them. In Orkney, Midsummer's Day 1919 started like any. It would end like no other. As a light breeze gently rippled the waters, and with a clear blue sky overhead, the great battleships of Vice Admiral Fremantle's 1st Battle Squadron put to sea. He'd been asked by the new Commander-in-Chief of the Grand Fleet, Admiral Madden, against his wishes, to complete a torpedo training exercise. Fremantle knew that these final days before the armistice signing could be very dangerous. Just before 11:30, Reuter's signal to Scuttle was raised on the Emden. It looked innocent enough. Paragraph 11 bestätigen. Roughly, paragraph 11, confirm. At 12:16, a single bell was heard to toll. As the former flagship Friedrich der Grosse started to list, her bell warned the British of what was happening. It wasn't long before other ships also started to go down. At 12:54, the König Albert, 10 minutes past 1, the first of the battle cruisers Moltke, and 5 minutes later, another battleship, Kronprinz Wilhelm. Within a half hour, she was followed by 5 more battleships, Kaiser, Große Kurfürst, Prinz Regent Luitpold, Kaiserin and König. And the first light cruiser, Dresden, was followed by 2 others, Brümmer and Köln, just minutes later. 10 minutes before 2, the second battle cruiser, Seydlitz, rolled over onto her starboard side. She looked like a beached whale, and later many visitors would mistake her for the outline of an island. As soon as Reuter's signal was given, sailors started to leave their sinking ships. Very soon, the whole floe was covered with boats and scattered with all manner of flotsam, a scene of chaos against a background of shouts of terror, panic and jubilation, the sound of rushing water, the explosive sounds of ships rolling and sinking, and machinery scraping across decks. As they had no clear line of sight, the destroyers received Reuter's orders much later. But like the bigger ships, they now started to go down. British Guard ships darted around, pell-mell, trying to get the crews to go back on board, threatening and machine-gunning groups of cowering sailors. The scene on the floe was one of absolute chaos. Strangely, they also seemed to waste time taking down the defiant flags that had been raised. Apparently, symbolism seemed as important to some British officers as keeping the enemy's ships afloat. One by one, boats were collected and the German crews consolidated on the decks of British battleships. Amidst the chaos, one unlikely group of eyewitnesses was caught. It was a group of children from Stromness Public School on a special day outing with their teachers. Around 300 had been aboard an Admiralty tug, the Flying Kestrel. It was both frightening and exciting. As soon as Fremantle's ships, now way out at sea, received the news, the torpedo exercise was immediately abandoned and they raced back. As the squadron's flagship Revenge came back into the floe, Bayern could be seen starting to sink. On board the British battleship, a young midshipman, Ty David, remembered catching sight of the German battleship's final moments just as his own ship's anchors were being weighed. At 2:15 and 2:45, 2 more of Germany's great battle cruisers went down. Von der Tann was the first, and then Dörflinger. As Moltke had gone down, crews on the Dörflinger had witnessed her final moments, singing an old hunting song, Wohl auf Kameraden. Her commander had warned his officers the previous evening to be ready in case the British were to try anything. As soon as Reuter's signal was received, carefully prepared planning immediately went into action. Deep in the bowels of the ship, seacocks were opened to allow seawater into the hull, and once opened, valve threadings were destroyed and wheels thrown overboard, making closing them again impossible. Every possible entry point for the water to speedily spread through the ship was then opened in the same way: ventilation shafts, bulkhead doors, portholes and condenser hatches. Around 2:45, Derflinger joined the others already on the bottom of the flow. As she went, she rolled over onto her port side, going down fast by the bow, only her aft turrets, Caesar and Doro, still visible. As the Iron Dog slid into the depths, her bulkhead started to collapse, the last cries of a dying ship. Attempts to beach the light cruiser Bremser were only partially successful. She rolled over just as she was entering shallow water in Swanbister Bay. Some extraordinary time-lapse photographs captured the Scuttle's progress. One showed the light cruiser Karlsruhe slowly sinking from sight over a period of an hour. Another showed the battleship Markgraf rolling over to crash onto her starboard side. By 5 o'clock, it was all over. The last ship, Germany's latest battlecruiser Hindenburg, went down. She was in shallow water and settled on her keel, only her funnel and at low tide her turrets still visible. By the end of the day, the Germans had successfully sent more than 50 of the 74 interned ships to the bottom. The British had only managed to beach 18 destroyers, as well as 4 light cruisers and 1 battleship, the Baden. In just 2 hours, 80% of what the Germans would eventually sink that day had already gone to the bottom. On his flagship, in front of assembled British and German officers, Reuter was publicly berated by Fremantle. Privately, the British Admiral felt differently. He admitted that any naval officer faced with the same decision that had faced Reuter would have acted in the same way. That night, Reuter's men slept on cold steel. Huddled together on deck, the bedraggled and wet sailors spent their first night as prisoners of war on British battleships. However, they must have been proud of what they'd accomplished. But it wasn't over. They would spend another 7 months in captivity. It wasn't until March the 31st, 1920, that the forgotten sailors of Scapa Flow would finally make it home. Von Trotter was on the quayside to welcome them back. The day after the German ships had gone down, their wrecks became a problem. At low tide, fishing boats would run onto their hulls, but there were also benefits. Locals immediately started stripping what they could from the beached destroyers. There was a fortune to be made from the precious metals. But before any large-scale salvage work could be started, the ships that had been beached were cleaned up and passed on to the various Allied navies, either to be incorporated or to be reverse-engineered to discover their secrets or to use as target ships. With high scrap metal prices, a number of professionals decided to approach the British Admiralty and buy some of the wrecks. What had taken a little over 3 hours to sink would now take more than 17 years to bring back up to the surface. A number of smaller boats, the destroyers, were successfully raised, but it was the men of Cox and Danks who pulled off what would become the greatest salvage in history. Their leader, and their inspiration, was a young 36-year-old engineer, Ernst Cox. Cox might not have been an expert in salvage, but what he did know was the scrap metal business. He was confident he could learn the rest. In 1924, he bought the salvage rights to 2 capital ships, as well as over 24 destroyers. Immediately, he started work on the lighter destroyers. He used them to learn and develop new methods. Using a specially converted German dry dock and rows of powerful winches, Cox used the ebb and flow of the tides to naturally lift the ships. On the bigger ships, however, he developed a way for workers to enter the submerged hull spaces no matter what the outside conditions were. Airlocks were built out of old boiler tubes, welded together and assembled like towers above the upturned hulls. When Cox finally stopped, he'd lifted some of the greatest ships of the German Navy. The Hindenburg was the first big challenge. Divers had to work in the dark, feeling their way around inside the hulls until patches could be applied to the holes and the water pumped out. One by one, the enormous ships were brought back up to the surface. It was slow and painstaking work. Success always remained elusive. Once refloated, the huge upturned hulls had to be towed back out to sea, across the very often dangerous waters of the Pentland Firth before being finally broken up. The man who took over carried on what Cox had started, but brought a better business mind. Robert Watson Macrone was not only able to lift ships, but he was also able to do it profitably. Cox and Macrone were helped by the knowledge of one man, Tom Mackenzie. He was also an engineer, but he'd done a lot of work for the Navy, and his salvage experience was invaluable. Starting with the Bayern in 1933, the balance of the German fleet was raised, and finally, at the end of 1939, just before the Second World War broke out, the battlecruiser Derfflinger was also brought up. Throughout the war, she'd been laying with her hull upturned before being taken to the breakers in early 1946. She'd arrived just days before her old Jutland rival, Jellicoe's flagship, the Iron Duke, had been towed to the same yard. Today, Derfflinger's bell continues to ring. It hangs outside a small church on the island of Eriskay on Scotland's west coast. The work brought much-needed employment to the flow. It even brought a new kind of tourism. It's ironic to think that this massive loss of shipping actually saved Orkney from the worst ravages of the Depression years. Today, across the flow, nothing visibly tells the story of what happened that day, but below the waters, the wrecks of 7 ships remain, 3 battleships and 4 light cruisers. You can see many of the artifacts in Orkney's 2 museums, but some, including some of the ship's bells, were given back to the German Navy. And of course the graves of 9 German sailors who died as a result of the Scuttle. 8 of these sailors were shot on the day, in the panic and the chaos. All of them were carrying flags of surrender. The last was a young engineer who was shot 2 days later. He was a prisoner of war on a British battleship. These sailors were the last German casualties of World War I. If you'd like to support more films like this, you can. You can either make a small donation or buy a signed copy of any one of my books. If you do either, thank you. Go to shop.scapaflow1919.com.